There is a specific, agonizing violence in discovering that your entire existence, your entire capacity for maternal love, has been legally classified as a temporary, unpaid contracting job. We live in an American society that relentlessly demands absolute devotion from mothers, and this demand is amplified tenfold for stepmothers. You are culturally mandated to overcompensate, to prove every single day that you are not the wicked caricature from a fairy tale, to bleed yourself dry emotionally and physically for a child that does not share your DNA, all to earn a seat at a family table that can be pulled out from under you at any given moment. Rachel Pendleton spent 12 years building a family inside a sprawling, historic stone mansion in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, one of the most aggressively affluent, old-money suburbs of Boston. She traded her late 20s and her entire 30s to rehabilitate, nurture, and raise her husband's son, Julian. And on a freezing Tuesday morning, exactly 3 days after Julian's 18th birthday, the ultimate, terrifying reality of the American legal system was delivered to her across the kitchen island she had meticulously redesigned. It did not arrive with a scream or a dramatic argument. It arrived in a standard, heavy-stock manila envelope, slid across the polished marble by the boy whose scraped knees she had bandaged, whose night terrors she had soothed, and whose college application essays she had exhaustively edited. When you raise a child from the age of 6, you believe that the thousands of invisible, grueling hours of daily caregiving construct an unbreakable psychological bond. Rachel looked at Julian, a tall, impeccably groomed young man wearing a cashmere sweater she had bought him for Christmas, expecting to see her son. Instead, she was looking at a corporate liquidator. Julian did not avoid her eyes. He maintained a terrifyingly calm, perfectly polite posture, the exact posture his father, Arthur Pendleton, used when dismissing an underperforming portfolio manager. Julian tapped the manila envelope with his index finger and informed Rachel, utilizing the sterile, emotionless vocabulary of a probate attorney, that the 60-day notice to vacate the premises was formally enclosed. He stated that the property, the Chestnut Hill estate where Rachel had lived for over a decade, had legally transferred into his sole possession upon his 18th birthday, as dictated by his late grandfather's irrevocable generation-skipping trust. He explained, without a single tremor in his voice, that he planned to sell the estate to a luxury condominium developer, and that her continued presence in the primary residence was an unacceptable liability to the impending real estate transaction. I want you to truly process the profound, paralyzing shock of that moment. Rachel did not gasp. Her brain simply refused to synthesize the data. She stared at the boy, searching for a trace of the vulnerable 6-year-old who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms, terrified that his biological mother, a woman who had abandoned him in a drug-fueled haze, was coming back to take him away. Rachel had spent 12 years acting as the absolute, impenetrable shield between Julian and his trauma. When Arthur, a wealthy, emotionally vacant man entirely consumed by managing his family's generational wealth, decided he needed a wife to stabilize his chaotic domestic life, he found Rachel. She was a dedicated, empathetic elementary school teacher, radiating warmth and patience. Arthur did not marry a partner. He actively recruited a highly qualified, emotionally desperate savior for his broken son. And Rachel, conditioned by a culture that romanticizes the act of fixing broken people, willingly stepped into the trap. For 12 agonizing years, Rachel was the sole emotional architect of the Pendleton household. Arthur provided the capital, the trust funds, and the elite zip code, but Rachel provided the actual, grueling labor of parenting. She was the one who navigated the cutthroat, hyper-competitive environment of Massachusetts private schools, sitting in countless parent-teacher conferences, defending Julian when his deeply buried abandonment issues manifested as behavioral problems. She spent thousands of hours driving to lacrosse practices in freezing sleet, packing organic lunches, and acting as the constant, tireless buffer between Julian and his father's chillingly high expectations. Arthur was a ghost in his own home, retreating to his study with a glass of scotch the moment he walked through the door, delegating the entirety of the emotional heavy lifting to his wife. And Rachel accepted it. She accepted the exhaustion, the lack of appreciation, and the subtle, constant reminders from the Chestnut Hill elite that she was an outsider who had married into money. She swallowed her pride and buried her own ambitions because she truly, deeply believed she was building a permanent family. She believed the American myth that love and relentless sacrifice eventually solidify into an unbreakable legal and emotional reality. But the American legal system does not recognize emotional labor. It does not care how many midnight fevers you broke or how many teenage crises you successfully navigated. If you are a step-parent who has not legally adopted the child, you are entirely invisible in the eyes of the law. You are a biological and legal stranger. Arthur had specifically prevented Rachel from formally adopting Julian, citing incredibly complex, highly manufactured concerns about the structure of his family's generational trust. He had assured Rachel, looking her dead in the eye with the practiced sincerity of a seasoned sociopath, that the paperwork was entirely unnecessary. He promised her that she was the boy's true mother, that their bond was stronger than any legal document, and that he had structured his own private will to ensure she would always be taken care of, regardless of the trust mechanics. Rachel, blinded by her devotion to the boy and her misplaced trust in her husband, never demanded to see the actual documents. She chose to believe in the illusion of security, completely unaware that she was building her entire life on a highly unstable fault line designed specifically to swallow her whole. The catastrophic collapse of that illusion began exactly 4 months ago, when Arthur Pendleton suffered a massive, fatal myocardial infarction on the squash court of his exclusive country club. His death was sudden, violent, and entirely unexpected. Rachel was devastated, thrown into a chaotic vortex of grief and funeral planning. But amid the mourning, she immediately focused all her remaining energy on protecting Julian. He was 17, a high school senior, just months away from graduation and college enrollment. She believed they would lean on each other, that the shared trauma of losing Arthur would finally cement their bond forever. She believed she was his mother, his guardian, his only remaining anchor in a terrifying world. However, the psychological shift in Julian after his father's death was not a descent into shared grief. It was an immediate, chilling recalibration. Within weeks of the funeral, the subtle dynamics of the household began to fundamentally alter. Julian stopped asking for Rachel's advice. He stopped updating her on his college admissions progress. He began taking closed-door meetings in his father's old study with a team of high-priced estate lawyers from downtown Boston. When Rachel inquired about the meetings, expressing concern about the stress he was under, Julian would offer a tight, patronizing smile and assure her that he was simply handling the administrative transition of the estate, exactly as his father had trained him to do. He adopted Arthur's vocabulary, Arthur's cold, evaluating stare, and Arthur's absolute detachment. Rachel convinced herself it was merely a coping mechanism, a teenage boy trying to emulate his dead father to feel close to him. She did not realize she was watching a highly sophisticated predator hatch from a cocoon she had spent 12 years carefully guarding. The true nature of the trap Arthur had constructed, and Julian was now ruthlessly executing, was revealed in the sterile text of the eviction notice on the kitchen island. Rachel, her hands trembling violently, opened the envelope and read the attached legal summaries. The betrayal was so mathematically perfect, so comprehensively sociopathic, it defied human comprehension. Arthur had not left the Chestnut Hill mansion to Rachel. He had not left her a life estate, a provision that would have allowed her to remain in the home until her death. The house, along with the vast majority of Arthur's liquid assets, was permanently locked inside an ironclad, irrevocable trust established by Arthur's father. The trust explicitly stated that upon Arthur's death, the entirety of the principal would bypass any spouse and transfer directly, unconditionally, and absolutely to his biological male heir upon his 18th birthday. Arthur had known this for 12 years. He had known, every single time he kissed Rachel goodnight, every time he thanked her for managing Julian's therapy sessions, Every time he watched her sacrifice her own career and social life to raise his son, that he was utilizing her as a disposable asset. He had intentionally lied to her about his private will. He had left her a token sum, barely enough to cover a year's rent in the Boston area, essentially the equivalent of a severance package for a terminated nanny. He had traded 12 years of her life, her youth, and her absolute maternal devotion for the price of a mid-level luxury sedan. But the architectural cruelty of Arthur's lie paled in comparison to the absolute, unadulterated coldness of the 18-year-old boy sitting across from her. Rachel looked up from the legal documents, tears finally blurring her vision, her chest heaving with a suffocating, crushing panic. She looked at Julian, a boy she had taught how to drive, a boy she had held while he cried over his first heartbreak just a year ago. She asked him, her voice cracking, completely stripped of its dignity, how he could do this to her. She reminded him that she was his mother, that she had raised him, that this house was the only home they had ever known together. She begged him to understand that she had absolutely nowhere else to go, that she had surrendered her own financial independence a decade ago based on his father's promises. Julian did not flinch. He did not look away out of shame. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the marble island, and delivered a response that permanently shattered the foundational core of Rachel's sanity. He looked at the woman who had saved his life, and he utilized the exact, dismissive, arrogant tone of a wealthy elite swatting away a beggar. He told her, with absolute, terrifying calm, that she was not his mother. He stated that his father had hired her to perform a specific function because his biological mother was defective, and that she had performed that function adequately. But, he continued, the contract had expired the moment his father's heart stopped. He explained that the emotional attachment she felt was entirely her own projection, a pathetic byproduct of her own biological inadequacies. He told her that he had merely tolerated her presence for 12 years because his father required a stable domestic facade to maintain his standing at the investment firm. Julian looked at Rachel, analyzing her tear-stained, horrified face, and calmly stated that he was an adult now, he was in control of the Pendleton capital, and he had absolutely no further use for her services. He slid a pen across the marble, pointing to an acknowledgement of receipt form. He told her she had exactly 60 days to remove her personal effects from his property, or he would have his attorneys initiate formal trespassing and eviction proceedings with the local sheriff's department. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone walls of the mansion. Rachel realized, in that catastrophic, world-ending moment, that the boy she loved was completely dead. He had never really existed. The vulnerable, traumatized child she thought she had healed was merely a temporary illusion. Underneath the surface, nurtured by the invisible, toxic radiation of generational wealth and a sociopathic father, Julian had grown into an exact, flawless replica of the man who had hired her. They had utilized her empathy, weaponized her maternal instincts, and systematically drained her of 12 years of emotional labor, entirely devoid of a single ounce of genuine human connection. She was not a mother being evicted by her son. She was a piece of obsolete machinery being aggressively discarded by a corporation. I want you to think about the terrifying, absolute silence that descends when a fundamental pillar of your reality is violently removed. It is a silence so profound it creates a physical pressure behind your eyes. When Rachel Pendleton stood in that sprawling, immaculate Chestnut Hill kitchen, staring at the 18-year-old boy she had raised, the boy who had just clinically and legally severed her from existence, she did not scream. The American cultural narrative demands a dramatic, explosive reaction to betrayal, a chaotic outpouring of grief and rage. But real, catastrophic trauma, the kind that rewires your nervous system and shatters your identity, often manifests as total, paralyzing stillness. Rachel was experiencing a profound psychological hemorrhage. Every single memory she possessed of the last 12 years, every bedtime story, every shared laugh, every moment of perceived intimacy with Julian had to be instantly and brutally recontextualized. She had to accept that she had been hallucinating a family. She had spent over a decade participating in an elaborate, highly funded, one-sided simulation of motherhood. Julian stood up from the kitchen island, his posture radiating the terrifying, unearned arrogance of generational wealth. He did not offer a secondary glance, nor did he attempt to soften the blow. He simply picked up his keys and informed her that he was leaving for a weekend ski trip in Vermont with his fraternity brothers, a trip funded entirely by the trust he had just inherited. He advised her, with the cold detachment of a landlord, to begin packing immediately, noting that he expected the master suite and the primary living areas to be cleared of her personal effects upon his return on Sunday evening. He walked out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut with a definitive, echoing finality, leaving Rachel completely alone in a 10,000 square foot monument to her own subjugation. The immediate logistical reality of her situation was terrifying. She had exactly 60 days to dismantle a life she had believed was permanent. Because Arthur had deliberately prevented her from legally adopting Julian, and because the generational trust explicitly bypassed her, Rachel had absolutely no legal standing to challenge the eviction. She contacted a desperate, underfunded family law attorney in a panic, only to be told the brutal, unvarnished truth of Massachusetts probate law. The attorney, a weary woman who had seen this exact scenario play out 100 times among the Boston elite, explained that Rachel was, legally speaking, a temporary licensee on the property. She had no claim to the estate, no claim to Julian's inheritance, and the token sum Arthur had left her in his private will would barely cover the retainer required to mount a losing legal battle. The system was functioning exactly as it was designed to function, protecting the capital of the wealthy from the emotional claims of the people they utilized. Rachel spent the first 48 hours in a state of hyper-vigilant shock. She moved through the massive house like a ghost, mechanically packing 12 years of her life into cardboard boxes. Every object she touched was a landmine of manufactured memories. She packed the framed photographs of family vacations to Martha's Vineyard, vacations where Arthur had ignored them both while Rachel built sandcastles with Julian. She packed the custom-made Christmas stockings, realizing that she had been the only one who actually cared about filling them. She was dismantling the physical evidence of her own delusion. But as the initial shock began to subside, it was not replaced by sadness. It was replaced by a cold, radiating, absolutely terrifying clarity. We are taught that when we are wronged, particularly when we are wronged by a child we raised, our response should be one of tragic, enduring grace. We are expected to turn the other cheek, to forgive the ignorance of youth, and to walk away with our dignity intact, secure in the knowledge that we did our best. This is a narrative designed entirely to protect predators from the consequences of their actions. It is a narrative that demands the victim absorb the toxicity and quietly disappear. Rachel stopped packing. She sat on the floor of the master bedroom, surrounded by half-filled boxes, and she looked at the truth. Julian was not a confused, grieving teenager acting out of pain. He was a highly intelligent, fully conscious adult who had calculated the precise legal mechanism required to maximize his financial gain by rendering her homeless. He had learned this behavior from Arthur. Arthur had taught him that women like Rachel were expendable commodities, emotional shock absorbers to be utilized until they were no longer cost-effective. Julian was executing his father's blueprint perfectly. If Rachel simply packed her boxes and left, she was validating that blueprint. She was accepting her role as the disposable, unpaid contractor. She realized that if she wanted to survive this, if she wanted to reclaim any fragment of her own humanity, she could not act like a mother mourning a lost son. She had to act like an adversary facing a hostile corporate takeover. She could not fight Julian in the probate courts, because the law was designed by men like Arthur to protect boys like Julian. She had to fight him in the dark. Rachel stopped crying. She walked into Arthur's old study, the room Julian had commandeered for his meetings with the estate lawyers. She knew this room intimately. For 12 years, she had cleaned it, organized it, and respected its boundaries as Arthur's private sanctuary. But Arthur was dead, and Julian was in Vermont. She began a systematic, highly focused forensic examination of the space. She bypassed the heavy oak desk and went directly to the massive, built-in mahogany bookshelves. She was not looking for legal documents regarding the trust. She knew those were airtight. She was looking for the leverage that men like Arthur Pendleton invariably keep hidden. Men who view human beings as disposable assets inevitably view the law with the same sociopathic disregard. Arthur was a wealth manager for incredibly powerful, fiercely private Boston families. You do not maintain that level of power for decades simply by offering sound investment advice. You maintain it through leverage, blackmail, and the highly orchestrated concealment of catastrophic financial crimes. Rachel knew Arthur's habits. She knew he possessed a terrifying, obsessive need for control. He would never fully trust a digital server. He would always maintain a physical, undeniable record of his most dangerous transactions. She spent 6 hours tearing the study apart, checking behind baseboards, feeling the underside of the heavy furniture, running her hands along the ornate molding. She found it exactly where she knew it would be, hidden in plain sight. Behind a false spine on a set of antique encyclopedias Arthur had claimed were a family heirloom, she found a small, heavy, biometric safe. She did not have Arthur's fingerprint, but she had something far more valuable. She had 12 years of intimate domestic knowledge. She knew that Arthur, despite his arrogance, was deeply paranoid about mechanical failure. He always maintained a manual override key for every electronic lock in the house. She went to his master bathroom, opened the false bottom of his expensive shaving kit, a hiding spot she had discovered years ago, while looking for a lost cufflink, and retrieved a small, intricately cut skeleton key. She walked back to the study, her heart hammering a slow, deliberate rhythm against her ribs. She inserted the key into the hidden mechanical lock on the back of the safe. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. Rachel opened the heavy steel door. Inside, she did not find cash or jewelry. She found 3 thick, heavily bound leather ledgers and a single, encrypted external hard drive. She carried the ledgers to the desk and opened the first one. It was not a record of legal investments. It was a meticulously detailed, entirely handwritten log of massive, systemic financial fraud. It detailed the creation of complex offshore shell companies, the deliberate manipulation of tax codes, and the highly orchestrated embezzlement of funds from the very generational trusts Arthur was paid to manage. But the most terrifying aspect of the ledger was not the fraud itself, it was the leverage. Arthur had meticulously documented the illegal activities of his most powerful clients, politicians, judges, and real estate developers. He had built an empire not just on money, but on mutually assured destruction. Rachel realized she was holding the nuclear codes to the entire elite ecosystem of Chestnut Hill. But as she opened the third ledger, the breath was completely knocked out of her lungs. This ledger was different. It did not contain client information. It contained a detailed, chronological accounting of the Arthur Pendleton Private Trust, the very trust Julian had just inherited. Rachel began to read, her eyes scanning the meticulous handwriting. The truth she uncovered was so grotesque, so profoundly twisted, that it fundamentally rewrote the entire architecture of the last 12 years. Arthur Pendleton had not just lied to Rachel about his private will, he had lied to Julian about the nature of the trust. The irrevocable generation-skipping trust did not bypass the spouse to protect the capital. The trust did not exist at all. It was a complete, highly elaborate fabrication. Arthur's father had died bankrupt, having squandered the family fortune decades ago. The massive wealth that Arthur managed, the sprawling Chestnut Hill estate, the millions of dollars in liquid assets, did not come from old money. It came entirely from the systemic, illegal embezzlement Arthur had committed over the last 20 years. The entire Pendleton empire was built on stolen funds. But the final, devastating entry in the ledger, written just weeks before Arthur's fatal heart attack, revealed the true, sociopathic masterpiece of his deception. Arthur knew the federal authorities were closing in. He knew an audit of his firm was inevitable, and that his massive fraud was about to be exposed. He needed an exit strategy. He needed a scapegoat. He had intentionally structured his assets, using falsified legal documents and corrupt attorneys, to appear as if they were locked in a generational trust, transferring directly to Julian upon his 18th birthday. But in reality, Arthur had legally positioned Julian to inherit the entirety of the financial liability. He had engineered a scenario where, when the federal indictments inevitably dropped, the 18-year-old boy would be the sole, legal owner of the stolen assets, completely exposed and entirely responsible for the catastrophic fallout, while Arthur planned to fake his own death and vanish offshore. The heart attack on the squash court had simply been a genuine, biological interruption of his sociopathic escape plan. Rachel sat in the dead silence of the study, the leather ledger resting in her lap. Julian was not the arrogant, triumphant heir to a massive fortune. He was a clueless, arrogant boy who had just aggressively demanded full ownership of a sinking ship rigged with high explosives. He had evicted the only person on Earth who actually cared about him, believing he was securing his empire, completely unaware that he had just locked himself inside a federal trap designed by his own father. Rachel looked at the ledger, and then she looked at the eviction notice sitting on the desk. She realized that she did not have to fight Julian. She did not have to hire lawyers or beg for her home. She simply had to step aside and let the architecture of his father's cruelty execute him. She had the absolute power to save him, to warn him, or she could remain silent and watch the FBI tear his life apart. The choice was entirely hers. There is a specific, razor-sharp clarity that descends upon a person when they realize they hold the absolute power of life and death over the individual who has just attempted to destroy them. It is a clarity that burns away all societal expectations of forgiveness, maternal duty, and turning the other cheek. When Rachel Pendleton sat in the heavy mahogany study of the Chestnut Hill estate, staring at the handwritten ledgers that detailed Arthur's massive federal embezzlement and his sociopathic plan to frame his own son, she did not feel a surge of protective, motherly instinct. For 12 years, she had acted as the shield between Julian and the world. But Julian had explicitly, legally, and brutally revoked her status as his mother. He had looked her in the eye and reduced her 12 years of exhausting, uncompensated love to an expired contracting job. Rachel realized, with a terrifying, absolute calm, that Julian did not just inherit Arthur's stolen money. He had inherited his father's soul. He was a predator. And Rachel, after 12 years of subjugation, finally understood that you do not protect a predator. You let them walk directly into the trap they so arrogantly demanded to own. She did not burn the ledgers. She did not call Julian in Vermont to warn him. She did not pack her bags and flee into the night like a frightened victim. Rachel executed a highly systematic, flawlessly calculated extraction plan, utilizing the exact same cold corporate efficiency that Julian had used to evict her. She spent the next 48 hours entirely focused on the external hard drive she had found in the safe. She knew Arthur's passwords, not because he had shared them, but because she had spent 12 years managing his life, observing his habits, and compensating for his paranoia. She decrypted the drive, revealing the full, unadulterated digital footprint of his massive financial fraud. It contained the exact routing numbers for the offshore shell companies, the falsified tax returns, and the digital paper trail that directly linked the stolen funds to the very estate Julian was currently claiming as his own. Rachel meticulously copied the entire contents of the hard drive and the high-resolution scans of the handwritten ledgers onto 3 separate, highly encrypted flash drives. She placed one in a secure safety deposit box at a small bank in a neighboring town. She placed the second inside a sealed envelope addressed to the lead federal prosecutor for the District of Massachusetts, ready to be mailed. She kept the third drive in her purse. When Julian returned from his fraternity ski trip on Sunday evening, he walked through the heavy oak doors of the estate radiating the supreme confidence of a man who believed he had successfully conquered his world. He dropped his expensive duffel bag in the foyer and called out for Rachel, clearly expecting to find her frantically packing boxes, a broken, defeated woman submitting to his authority. Rachel was not packing. She was sitting at the polished marble kitchen island, wearing a sharp, tailored suit she hadn't worn since her days as a teacher, drinking a glass of Arthur's expensive scotch. The manila envelope containing her eviction notice was sitting exactly where Julian had left it. Julian walked into the kitchen, his arrogant smile faltering slightly as he registered her completely relaxed, defiant posture. He attempted to reassert dominance, leaning against the counter and asking her, in that chillingly polite tone, if she was having difficulty comprehending the 60-day deadline. Rachel did not raise her voice. She did not display a single ounce of the emotional devastation she had exhibited just days prior. She looked at the boy she had raised, and she finally saw him clearly. A fragile, arrogant construct built entirely on stolen money and unearned entitlement. She reached into her purse, pulled out the encrypted flash drive, and placed it gently on the marble island next to the eviction notice. She told Julian that she fully comprehended the eviction notice. She stated that she would be vacating the premises within 24 hours, leaving the keys on the counter. She explained that she had no desire to contest his claim to the estate, nor did she want a single penny of the inheritance he was so desperate to protect. Julian's eyes narrowed. He was a predator, but he was a young, inexperienced one. He could sense that the dynamic had shifted violently, but he could not identify the threat. He asked her, a hint of genuine uncertainty creeping into his voice, what was on the drive. Rachel smiled. It was not a warm, maternal smile. It was the terrifying, dead smile of an executioner. She explained to Julian, utilizing the same sterile, legal vocabulary he had used against her, exactly what he had actually inherited. She laid out the architecture of Arthur's massive federal fraud. She detailed the stolen funds, the offshore accounts, and the falsified generational trust. She watched the color completely drain from Julian's face as she systematically dismantled the illusion of his wealth, replacing it with the horrific reality of his impending criminal liability. She did not spare him the final, most devastating truth. She looked him directly in the eyes and explained his father's exit strategy. She told Julian that Arthur had specifically engineered the transfer of the estate upon his 18th birthday not out of love, but to legally position Julian as the primary suspect when the federal indictments dropped. She explained that he was holding the bag for a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme, and that the moment he attempted to sell the estate or move the capital, the FBI would freeze his assets and arrest him. The physical transformation of Julian Pendleton was instantaneous and catastrophic. The arrogant Heir vanished, replaced by a terrified, hyperventilating child. He stared at the flash drive, his hands trembling violently. He tried to deny it, stammering that she was lying, that she was trying to extort him out of spite. Rachel simply stood up. She told him that she had placed a copy of the hard drive and the ledgers in a safety deposit box. She informed him that she had arranged for a courier to deliver the evidence directly to the federal prosecutor's office if she did not check in every 48 hours. She had built a dead man's switch. She walked toward the front door, stopping briefly to look back at the shattered boy sitting in the massive, stolen kitchen. She delivered her final, parting words with absolute, surgical precision. She told Julian that she was leaving him exactly what he had asked for: full, uncontested ownership of his father's legacy. She advised him to hire a very good criminal defense attorney, because when the federal auditors arrived, the fact that he was just an arrogant 18-year-old boy would not save him from a 30-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. Rachel walked out of the heavy oak doors, leaving Julian Pendleton completely alone in a 10,000-square-foot federal trap, holding the deed to his own destruction. She got into her car and drove away from Chestnut Hill, entirely unburdened, leaving the burning wreckage of the Pendleton empire in her rearview mirror. Healing from that level of profound emotional exploitation is an agonizing, non-linear process. Rachel did not simply move on. She had to undergo intensive therapy to dismantle the deep-seated cultural conditioning that had convinced her to sacrifice her life for a family that viewed her as a disposable asset. She had to learn how to exist without the constant, exhausting demand of managing a sociopath's household. She moved to a small, vibrant community in the Pacific Northwest, completely severing all ties to the East Coast elite. She returned to teaching, focusing on early childhood education, pouring her empathy into an environment that actually valued it. She built a quiet, fiercely independent life, entirely on her own terms, completely free from the toxic gravity of generational wealth. As for Julian, the machinery of the American justice system operated with its usual brutal efficiency. Exactly 3 weeks after Rachel left, the FBI raided the Chestnut Hill estate. The massive financial fraud was exposed, creating a scandal that rocked the Boston financial sector. Julian, desperate and terrified, attempted to flee the country using the very funds his father had stolen, but his assets were immediately frozen. He was arrested at Logan Airport, stripped of his cashmere sweaters, and thrust into the unforgiving reality of the federal penal system. His high-priced lawyers, realizing the estate was entirely comprised of stolen capital, quickly abandoned him when his retainer ran out. The boy who had arrogantly evicted his only mother figure found himself completely alone, facing decades in prison, betrayed by the father he worshipped and abandoned by the society he thought he owned. The story of Rachel Pendleton is a terrifying, brilliant blueprint for radical survival. It exposes the deeply ingrained, highly destructive narrative that women, specifically stepmothers, are expected to absorb infinite cruelty in the name of familial duty. We are taught that our value is intrinsically tied to our capacity for endless sacrifice, even when that sacrifice is met with absolute sociopathy. But Rachel's story shatters that narrative. It teaches us that empathy is a precious resource, and when it is weaponized against us, we have the absolute right to revoke it. We have the right to stop acting as the shield for predators. We have the right to step aside and let the consequences of their actions consume them. Rachel did not destroy Julian. Julian destroyed himself by arrogantly demanding ownership of a legacy he did not understand. Rachel simply removed the safety net. This has been Sophia Coppola. Thank you for walking through this dark, complex exploration of human deception and survival. The stories we dissect here are meant to challenge the comfortable illusions we are fed by a society that often prioritizes wealth and biological entitlement over basic human decency. If this psychological autopsy resonated with you, if it gave you a new perspective on the invisible power dynamics operating in your own world, please hit that subscribe button, leave a detailed rating, and share this podcast with someone who might need to hear the unvarnished truth. Keep your boundaries absolute, protect your empathy fiercely, and never allow anyone to tell you that their cruelty is just the way the world works. Until next time.